As long-term listeners of the podcast will know, I'm a big fan of Coventry, as are you.
Yes. The Coventry contingent.
So I went back to see my parents and went for a lovely trip to Warwick Arts Centre to see...
Lovely Warwick Arts Centre. I really like Warwick Arts Centre.
And I caught the new film Sing Sing.
Oh, gosh.
Which is about a group of inmates in a prison in America that have a rehabilitation program where they put on plays every 6 months. Absolutely, that's brilliant in terms of not simply just about how the arts can help individuals find themselves, but also about how they as inmates, when they've just been deprived of a space, are given a rehearsal room to allow themselves to feel like they have four corners of a room that they can own and do whatever they want inside. So that's just my short tidbit of a brilliant film if anyone needs something
really
to go and see.
I because I've been indulging in my other obsession and have spent 3 days watching cricket. I haven't done anything over the weekend that's even vaguely arty, but it is very much on my list of things. And what I was fascinated reading about it is that it's got Coleman Domingo as the lead, but it's also got somebody who has actually lived it playing themselves, hasn't it?
Yes.
Well?
So a group of the performers in the film are former inmates or former members of that very programme. And also Clarence Divine Eye Macklin is one of the leads and he plays himself, as you say. And that is amazing because then it kind of, your relationship with the film changes when you aren't just seeing people play other characters, they're playing a past version of themselves. In retrospect, and almost like interrogating their own existence when they were inmates and when they were part of this program, now as individuals out in the world able to have a bit more agency. But at the same time, you've also got Coleman Domingo, one of the greatest stage and screen actors of the century, now placed in that environment. So he does the to be or not to be speech from Hamlet quite early on, and you think, oh wow, I'm seeing Coleman Domingo do one of the greatest Shakespeare speeches ever. But then you say, oh, wait, hang on a sec. No, he's still an inmate. He still has to be part of this program.
Right.
And it's that whole interaction between fiction and reality really creates quite a succulent mix as a viewer. So yes, I would, totally recommend.
Okay, I'll definitely try and go. Definitely. Because it does sound wonderful.
So let's set up this week's episode of the What's on Stage podcast with...
me, Sarah Crompton.
And me, Alex Wood. We are going to be talking about perhaps some of our retrospective regrets as critics as to shows that we feel history has been more favourable to than we perhaps were when we reviewed it. And I think a lot of this boils down to, at the time, you only have sometimes a matter of hours or a matter of minutes to form your consensus of a show, to then place it in print.
Yeah, regrets, I've had a few. I mean, it's really interesting. As the autumn comes around, I go and teach at the British American Drama Academy and teach American theatre students, and I don't really teach them anything, I talk to them. And they have to write a review as part of their course because they need a written piece of work. Essentially, they're here for a conservatoire training as actors, but they do this one written piece. And it's always interesting because I have to think at the start of every autumn about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it and what a critic does, really. And it is interesting because I always say to them, there is no right or wrong. Everybody brings their own self into a theatre. And what you also need to bring into the theatre, though, is perhaps a bit of knowledge and perhaps a bit of seeing things before. And one of the things, therefore, that is hardest to do is when you encounter something that is unlike anything you've ever seen before. And the famous example is Pinter's The Birthday Party, which people didn't really love at all. I mean, it got almost uniformly bad reviews until I think Harold Hobson reviewed it in a Sunday paper and gave it a sort of half favourable idea. But it was absolutely slammed by everybody. And it was, I think, I mean, it's just been revived at Bath, and so everybody's considering it again. I think it was just its sheer unfamiliarity. And I think that is often the same with the plays that people find tricky. It's suddenly being faced with something that they weren't expecting. And there are other examples of that, which we might talk about a bit later. But the one I think I got wrong, and well, I don't know. The one I think I misjudged, let's say, is The Girl from the North Country, which was Conor McPherson using Bob Dylan songs to make a new story. And I didn't like it. And even now, I was talking to somebody about it quite recently. I didn't quite get it. And I've never known why I didn't get it. I don't particularly like Dylan. I don't think that helped. But I felt the story was kind of too much spun out of extant songs. I felt the story didn't carry. And yet people absolutely adored that show, and I was the one outlier. And, not often do I think, I don't mind being an outlier, because I think that's part of being a critic, that you just sort of have to say, well, sorry, not for me. But Girl from the North Country, I might go and see again, because I just, if it's revived, I'm going back, because I just wonder if I got it wrong.
It was fascinating with that one, because as a member of the editorial team, you register what the critic says when it first comes in, and that shapes your perspective of the show.
Yeah.
But I remember in this case, Daisy, who was our editor at the time, absolutely adored it.
I
think she was there on opening night as well. And she said, we've got to go re-review this when it comes to the West End. And I think there was a glowing 5-star review on What's on Stage within 8 months of your initial assessment. But then I also...
But she was enormously honourable, because she printed my initial reception. And you're absolutely right. She was there on the first night, and she had a completely different sense about it.
I did have to say that there was something that didn't feel very tangible about it, but I still found it very enchanting. And I remember coming out of the West End production and sort of floating down Charing Cross Road, being spellbound, but not really knowing why. And I think to this day, it kind of frustrates me that I don't know what exactly it was that worked for me, when so many other musicals that adopt the same form of taking a musician's back catalogue and reorchestrating it and then adding it to an original story sometimes can fall flat. And this one really, I think, could have fallen flat, because I think the narrative is a bit more sparse.
It is a bit sparse.
It's very Conor McPherson, but maybe he's already been quite a divisive writer anyway, and some of his plays do sort of adopt the same style that Girl from the North Country does.
Yeah, but I'd adored him, and I think that was the other thing. Maybe I just went in with the wrong expectations, because I'd always loved him. And the one thing I absolutely, remember from the night is loving Sheila Atim. So I'm always very glad about that, because I recognise that she was sensational, and I've never stopped thinking she was sensational. I didn't care. I do know the reasons I didn't like it, apart from Dylan. I didn't care for Shirley Henderson, who went on to win all the Best Actress awards. So, there you go. It's just, it is always that thing about theatre being so much at some deep visceral level a matter of taste. The really funny thing about Girl from the North Country is I remember walking out thinking that everybody would agree with me. And I was absolutely convinced that the reviews would be mediocre. And it was a sort of total shock to me when nobody except me hadn't had any reservations. Everybody seemed to just adore it. So it was an odd feeling that night. And most of the time when I feel that, when I'm running against the stream, I feel happy about it. I don't, I think you've got to have the courage of your convictions. But that night, I think maybe I should go and look at it again. Have you ever had that?
Yeah, well, sticking on the theme of shows at the Old Vic that have their world premiere, I remember one of the big high-profile shows that I reviewed quite early on in my years at What's on Stage was Emma Rice's Wise Children, the first production for the production company Wise Children. At that point, Emma Rice was coming off the back of her infamous time at Shakespeare's Globe, and then had set up this company, and there was a lot of chatter about it and some very high expectations. And at that point, I'd been a huge fan of her work at Knee High and a huge fan of what she'd done at the Globe. And I wonder again if that was part of why I really wasn't bowled over by Wise Children, in that my expectations were high. But then when they were almost affirmed rather than exceeded, I thought it was a very 3-star show. I remember, I think I described it as beige, and Daisy said, you're going to have to stand by that if anyone says or challenges you or comes to you for that. And I was like, okay, I guess this is, one of those learning points where you have to say, if you're a critic, you have to stand by your opinions for as long as it takes. And actually 7, 8 or 6 years on, I do maybe think I was slightly too harsh, because you don't want to see what other critics are thinking, but if they're all loving it and actually still hold it in high regard over half a decade later, you think maybe I was slightly too harsh at the time, which is very interesting. It
is very interesting and very difficult to weigh up. With the birthday party, I am always absolutely convinced I would have been on the wrong side of history. I mean, I don't, even now, I find it a Pinter play that is hard to love. And I've never really seen a production that convinced me of its genius. I think everything Pinter subsequently wrote is magical, and I really do understand why he is regarded as one of our great playwrights. But I do find The Birthday Party a play that is just so full of hatred and fear and dislike of women in particular, that I find it really tricky to watch. And I've never been convinced by its genius as a play. I think you would have had to recognise its arrival as something really distinctive. I think you would have heard that it was different. And I think that I might have got, but I'm not sure I'd have been on the right side of history with it.
I think the case of The Birthday Party kind of cuts to the core of perhaps one of the biggest flaws in theatre criticism, in that as a critic, you have to be informed by the shows that you've already seen or you've already read. And the moment that you encounter something unfamiliar, your instinct isn't to leap in, it's to try and weigh it up against those things.
Yeah.
But if that comparison doesn't work, oftentimes, and I think there's a lot of the time that critics do give shows the benefit of the doubt, but a lot of the time they don't, and will, perhaps more negatively respond to a piece because it doesn't feel like it's speaking the language that they accept as being the best sort of theatrical language that a show can adopt.
Pinter's really interesting to talk about in the history of criticism. I mean, Michael Billington, famously, who is Pinter's biographer, really didn't like Betrayal. He thought Betrayal was kind of thin. I mean, he didn't respond at all to the either to the reverse time structure, which generally seems to get a bad critical rap. Viz, sometimes Merrily We Roll Along, which does the same thing of ending at the beginning. But I think Billington did get Betrayal wrong. I think he really didn't understand the concept of it in some ways, and he's admitted that. And of course, now it's regarded as one of Pinter's very best plays, and it's probably certainly the most revived, I think. And then there was Moonlight, which I've talked before to Nancy about on the pod, which marked the return to Pinter to sort of full-length plays after a long period of writing short plays. And I remember going to the first night of that at the Almeida, and everybody walked out in silence because everybody was terrified that they would have got it wrong. And everybody didn't quite understand it, but didn't want to say it because it was, by that time, Pinter. And Pinter was like mega, mega famous and mega, mega important. And nobody wanted to admit that they were slightly baffled by it, if they were. I think the reviews for that were quite mediocre. My memory is that people said, oh, well, great playwright, but not quite a great return to form, which actually I thought I wasn't reviewing then, but I was spellbound by Moonlight and thought it was a great play. It's a really interesting thing, and it's so much what you bring into the theatre with you is either as a critic or indeed as an audience member, what your reaction is.
I think one of the times quite early on in my tenure as editor, you wrote a very, very positive review. Not completely positive, but overwhelmingly lavished certain aspects of it with praise, and then 3-starred it. And I didn't call you up on it at the time, but now I think in retrospect, you think you probably could have upped it from a 3-star to a 4-star.
Yeah, possibly a 5 actually now.
Which was
7 Methods of Killing Kylie Jenner.
Yes, by Jasmine Lee Jones, and won a number of awards, I think, and I think you actually pushed it for quite a few awards.
Yeah, I did. And quite rightly won the awards. And yeah, so that's the other thing. So there's 2 things, I think, about working as a professional critic rather than just being a member of the audience. One is that you are trying to be fair to everybody. And you're trying to judge it with an open mind. And with an open mind, I walked into that play and thought it was wild and bold and fabulous. I also thought it was slightly messy. And it is an odd thing that this is why I hate stars. I've always said to you, I absolutely know when I walk out of a theatre what I think. So when I walked out of 7 Methods of Kylie Jenner, I knew absolutely that I had heard a new, exciting voice, that I'd seen a play that I would remember for a long time, that I thought was totally thrilling as a piece of writing. I also thought it was a bit messy. I didn't adore the production, actually, looking back. So I think I like the writing better than the production. And what I should have thought, I think, is, because it's such a good piece of writing, then pushed up the stars. But in fact, I thought actually, as an overall experience, perhaps it's 3. But I really regret that. I really, really regret that, because I knew it was good and I kind of pulled myself back a bit. And in fact, since then, I think I've always, with new writing, tended to tip the other way. Even if I think it's flawed, that I will think, okay, if I'm in doubt with the stars, I'm going to go positive rather than negative, which happened with Sam Holcroft's A Mirror, which I absolutely think I was right about, and got 3-star, 2-star reviews, and I 4-starred it. And I absolutely think, to be honest, that again, I think it's a play that will go on and on and on, and it will have resonance.
It's funny as an editor, because sometimes I have to put the critic's hat on, and sometimes I can take the critic's hat off and put on the commissioning hat. And that one, in the case of Seven Methods, for example, almost you can tell from the way that you're writing about it initially that there's more to be said about the piece, or the piece needs to grow slightly and then can then get a reappraisal. So when that show came back and I think transferred into the main space at the Royal Court, we sent another critic along. And we don't always do that. We don't always re-review things. But if I think there's a lifespan for a show and everyone involved in it clearly felt that there was something else that they could do with it, you will send someone back and they will give it another write-up. I think I remember in the case of 6, Daisy reviewed it initially and 3-starred it.
Yeah.
And then it had a mammoth amount of change take place. And that by the time it got to the West End again, I think in 2021, we re-reviewed it after it reopened in lockdown. And by then it was considered a 5-star show. Yeah. So there is that thing that, as an editor, you have slightly more bandwidth in terms of building a greater consensus about a show. If you think, lots of good stuff is there, but it just needs that extra bit of work that actually won't happen by the time it hits its first press night, but might happen by the time it hits its 3rd or 4th press night or something.
There is a sort of gut reaction thing. And what I think is important is, even if you don't necessarily like a show as a critic, that you can at least, you can show your workings almost. And sometimes you just need a response, so that even if you haven't thought it was perfect, you've made the right response, that you've moved, sort of there's an impulse in you that takes you in the right direction. I think there's a really interesting thing, actually, which I hadn't thought we'd talk about, but about the relationship between an editor and a writer in these terms. Because I think if you're reading critics, you don't imagine there's an editor behind the reviews. But certainly in mainstream media, there is always an editor. And quite often not just the arts editor, but also an editor with an interest in things. And actually, it's very hard sometimes for those separate people to set aside whatever they thought of something and allow it. You always have to have the confidence that your critic is going to come up with a personal opinion that you're going to back. I always took that view as an arts editor, that it has to be the critic's personal opinion. You can't second guess them. They have to say what they think, but you hope that you will actually agree with them. And there were occasions when I didn't. With Charles Spencer, I didn't agree with Charlie about a play, and you just have to let him sort of run with it, really. And I thought he was an amazingly good critic, because his quality was he was always open-minded, and he would go in going, oh, I really don't like Carol Churchill, and then would come out saying it's the best thing I've ever seen, and I think that's what you want. You want open-mindedness, and open-mindedness both ways. Open-mindedness that's willing to say that something that is by somebody reputable and famous and great isn't very good, as well as the other way around, really, of backing new writing or seeing new things.
Your point about it also boiling down to the experience on the night is particularly important, because an editor might not always go on press night. They might go later in the run, or they might have sometimes gone in previews if they're writing a feature on something. So there's often very little chance that they'll have seen the same thing that you will have seen. One of the more extreme versions of that is Hayley McGee's Age is a Feeling, which, when it was at the Edinburgh Fringe, I didn't like very much, and it got blanket positive praise from others and got a Fringe First Award, and then transferred to London and got loads of positive reviews in London. But one of the central conceits of the play is that at the start she hands out cards to individuals, I believe, and then those cards are given back to her, and depending on which card she receives, she performs different parts of a life. from beginning to end. So she'll skip over certain sections if she doesn't get a certain card, and she'll pick other bits and alight on those for a bit longer. So stuff about her cat dying or stuff about a romantic experience that went wrong. I just wonder if the configuration of the cards that I received was probably less interesting than a critic who had gone the night before or the night after. So that for me felt like a more extreme version of how subjective the critical experience actually is when critics aren't going to the same performance. And we've talked about this before, how if there's 3 or 4 press performances in the run up to an opening night, the audience that you get on the Tuesday might not be as good as the audience that you get on the Thursday. Yeah. But the critics on the Tuesday might think, oh, well, the audience didn't really enjoy that one very much, so maybe it isn't very good. And actually an audience as a critic is very important for assessing whether or not a show is landing, because even if you think it might not be landing for you, it might be landing for 900 people around you. Yeah. But the same might also be true in that something might really resonate with you, but might not resonate with 900 other people.
I know. Well, that your relationship to the audience is one of the most interesting things. I mean, you shouldn't really be swayed by the audience, especially now, because press nights, I mean, we talked endlessly about this, and I really would like press nights to be separated from first nights, so that, when you've got the friends and family in and they're all whooping away, it's really hard to judge anything. And sometimes they're reacting wrong. Sometimes you think, oh, don't laugh at that because it's actually not funny. Just absolutely just, hold the line a bit and watch the play. I like multiple press nights because actually, in some ways, I think, it just makes it easier. It gives you thinking time. But I certainly like early press nights, so you've got the thinking time. And the thing I probably like least in any show is running out and having to make an instant call on it. Mm-hmm. I don't think that leads to particularly good reviewing. Some people are brilliant at it. Charlie he hated it, but he was brilliant at it. But some people, like me, I need to sort of sleep on things and then they emerge in the morning. But I do think that audiences equally are important because you are trying to weigh up how something is going to land for people. And I think that's tricky. I mean, again, another famous first night was Sarah Kane's Blasted. And there's quite a lot of conversation around that about how much there was a concerted attack on Kane during that. It was a different era, so there weren't as many outlets of conversation. I mean, there weren't online reviews. There were WhatsOnStage, I don't think, reviewed that. I think the Stage was a paper then. So it was a different era, and the mainstream media took against it. There's no doubt that they felt it was violent and unpleasant and in your face. It gave its name to a kind of a whole genre of theatre. Rather like The Birthday Party, people were just appalled by it. And I don't know, again, I went to see it later, but I went to see it within my heart wanting to like it because I recognised by that point, I think people did recognise that Sarah Kane was important and that what she was writing about was not the violence itself, but the motivations for violence and the sadness and decay of society. Again, it's just really, really hard to judge. And I saw it with a normal audience. And I think seeing things with a normal audience, people have actually paid their ticket stub, is really helpful because they responded to it. They leant into it. They didn't lean away. There wasn't the sense of it, the shock of the first night. People did lean into it and wanted to understand it. And I think that's an interesting balance.
Yeah, and there's very much a sense with shows like Blasted or The Birthday Party that what they kind of suggest is that critics can be on the wrong side of history more often than they should. I mean, you can take something like We'll Rock You, where the critics were like, knives are out, the Dominion had never seen such a bloodbath, but then it stood the test of time and ran for 12 years. Jury's
still out on We Will Rock You. I mean, I'm sorry, audiences, it is classically the one that is critic proof.
Yeah.
Anybody who says anything against it is wrong, but
Yeah, maybe that's I feel as though lumping in Sarah Kane and Ben Elton's Jukebox Musical in the same sentence or thought feels a bit sacrilegious. But there is that sense of, even in the present day, and I know you talk about print outlets, but in this TripAdvisor-based star-rated world that we live in, critics have to find that sense of relevance somehow. And I think that that's the modern challenge that now exists, is that I think the presence of a critic in the theatre ecosystem has shifted so dramatically in the last 25 years that you kind of have to sit somewhere different. You have to be a chronicler as well as a critic, and you do have to kind of think about a show's place in history rather than just that individual experience for a fleeting amount of time, because, you know, there are enough websites now that aggregate consumer reviews of plays that, you know, I think, take an example like opening night. There was a show score review aggregator that already had 5.5 out of 10, and it hadn't even opened for opening night. That was just from previews. And if people are already forming that consensus before a show has been locked for critics,
it's interesting, isn't it?
It opens up a whole other debate about, you know, how does a critic now fit into that system if there's many weeks in which the public is already voicing their opinion on social media or these aggregation platforms.
So what I say to my students is that the part of the critic's role, and I think this is really important if you read historic criticism, is that they have to describe, and that it's really, really important. A main part of a review should be a description of what you've seen, and that should actually be reasonably neutral. So there's your opinion, there is, you know, that side of making a judgment on something, but you are not fulfilling your role historically unless you're also learning to describe. And I feel that quite strongly. I think you're absolutely right. You have to, if you're going to write about theatre professionally, which essentially is what distinguishes the critic from, you know, the aggregator, is that you have to set your own set of criteria, which may not remain fixed. I feel that my own view now is that I lean more into new work than I did. I really, really will try as hard as I possibly can to understand a new play, to give it the benefit of the doubt, to give it a sort of space to grow in my head, because I think that, you know, new plays need backing. It's really hard to get a new play on. So the most recent one I remember, apart from A Mirror, was the House of Shades at the Almeida, which was by Beth Steele, which was not perfect, but which I sat in the car with my friend Susan afterwards discussing for hours. And I think, and I wrote a really positive review of House of Shades, which went against the run. On the whole, the run of reviews was disappointing. I think it was 2 stars and below. And I really felt strongly that Beth Steele is one of the best voices that we've got, and always interesting in how she writes about family and how she writes about women, how she writes about history and how she places herself in a theatrical context. And then I felt really justified by that review, because then, you know, along comes When the Stars Come Down, which is kind of one of the most vibrant, brilliant new plays of recent years, and everybody loved it. And I thought, yeah, I was on track with that. So that's one of my feelings, that I want to lean into new work, and that's one of my rules. But my other rule is that if I really, really feel it's failed an audience, but you've got to represent their view as well, especially if they're paying 80 quid for a ticket. Yeah,
that is the other side of it, that we, as critics, have the luxury of not really addressing in our write-ups, is the cost of a ticket or the price of going out to see something every evening. And I think for a lot of people that does affect how they respond to work. If, you know, you can be very excited about only spending 5 quid and seeing something that is going to change your life, but at the same time, if you see something that leaves you a bit apathetic and you spent a few £100s on a night out, you're going to probably have a more negative perspective on it than you would if you'd spent less. I did feel that people who paid for House of Shades would have a really good night out, actually. So I do try and balance both things. You know, I thought it had all the merits of being a gripping story and a bold conceit, and it's hard though, isn't it? I mean, it's just a fascinating thing, and you've got to constantly be robust, constantly asking yourself what you're doing, constantly being brave when you walk out of theatre and not panicking. It's funny how I remember quite clearly to this day Sam Steiner's it was his second play. So he did Lemons, which had a slightly less successful West End run, but was brilliant when it was at the Edinburgh Fringe. And then his second play was Kanye the First, which was about a woman who wakes up and thinks she's Kanye West, or the reincarnation of Kanye West, I think. And I think I just didn't like it very much. I think I gave it a 2-star write-up, but actually it has lingered with me. And since then, he's gone on to produce some brilliant plays. And like you say, I think if I'd lent into more of the idea of a writer just experimenting and trying to crack that tricky second play and playing around with something and just saying, trying not to be too scathing to the point of you almost deterring their creative experimentation, and actually, trying to find more of the gold amongst the mud, so to speak, and raising that up and saying, look, there is so much here that could be successful. But you also do sometimes get carried away in the few hours that you've got by trying to eviscerate what you don't think works.
Yeah.
And it's very intoxicating to dislike something.
It is.
It's very easy to write a negative review, just in the same way it's very easy to write an all-out rave.
Yeah.
The hardest bit is the space in between. Like those 3-star reviews that everyone says aren't worth anything to anyone are by far the hardest to write up, in my opinion.
Yeah, and they also, I always think people should value them, because that is the vast majority of things we see. I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, bringing it to the end, I once did a radio debate on this subject with Quentin Letts, who was the critic and who prided himself on being funny and a well-turned phrase. And there's a lot to be said for that. Sometimes people can make you laugh, and I think I don't make people laugh, and I tend to second guess my own, I wouldn't say cruelty, which I'm not sure I mean, but you can sometimes think of a phrase that really just is just crushing. So, for example, the other night a phrase went through my head about somebody, which was he's as limp as a stick of celery and about as enticing. And it wasn't anything I was reviewing. So, but I wouldn't have put that into a review, because though it was actually a very accurate description of what I was watching, I think I would have wanted not to be unkind. I have come to the view in my great old age that you don't want to be unkind, you don't want to crush people, and that sometimes it's better just to keep your nastiest thought to yourself. And that, I think, is not true of the history of criticism. I mean, Kenneth Tynan never held back from saying the most crushingly cruel thing he could think of about people like Vivian Leigh or whatever. But I think actually in our modern age, what you're trying to do is be fair, bring judgment, describe, but then come out with that judgment, have the courage of your convictions. So maybe I'm going to go back on myself and say, I was right about Girl from the North Country. No, I don't think I was.
I thought that was going to be a triumphant, way to wrap it all up.
No, I don't think I was. I think I was wrong. But anyhow, there you go.
Oh, well, we can play out with some Bob Dylan.
Yes, exactly.
I'm sure that won't cost us at all.
Whiny music.
Yeah. Heard it here
Bob
first.
Dylan fans, don't listen.
Yeah, it's a good thing we put that at the end of the podcast rather than at the start. Wonderful. So I think on that anti-Bob Dylan bombshell note, we should wrap up. So it's a goodbye from me, Alex Wood.
And a goodbye from me, Sarah Crompton.